Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Mobile World Congress 2018 webinar. We're going to be sharing our key findings and implications from last week's Mobile World Congress. I'm Larry Goldman from Analysys Mason, and I'll be joined by several of my colleagues. We'll be presenting for about a half an hour and then having time for question and answer. We will be recording this session, and a link to the recording and availability of the slides will be sent out tomorrow. We will be taking your questions after the presentation part, and you can enter your questions along the way. There's an Ask a Question tab that you should see visible on your screen at the bottom of your screen. So if you can enter your questions as we go along, then we'll start with them as soon as we've wrapped up the presentation. So we'll move on to the next slide. So for those of you who are not familiar, Analysys Mason is a telecoms and research focused company, and we cover a wide range of topics with our research topic. You can see them mentioned here, and in this work we do market sizing and forecasts and cover the important topics that are going on in these various areas to see reference here. And certainly our presentation today is made within the context of that ongoing research that we do and offer to our customers. So move on to the next slide. In today's webinar, we'll be covering four really important issues from Mobile World Congress. One is 5G, pretty obviously, and Caroline Gabriel and Roberto Company will both talk about various aspects of 5G. Secondly, automation. Automation in the network in particular is a big topic at Mobile World Congress, and Caroline Chappell will cover that. AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning is a big area, lots of work on that. Justin Vanderland, who covers that area for us, will cover artificial intelligence. And lastly, and actually very importantly, IoT is just an important thing that becomes part of our discussion anytime about telecoms. It was a really big issue at Mobile World Congress last week, and Michelle McKenzie will cover IoT. So we'll cover those topics, and then at the end of that, we will have Q&A. So if we can move on to the next slide. Just a little bit of context. You know, we're dealing with what's hot at Mobile World Congress, and I mentioned what the issues are, but we're dealing with them, we're understanding those, and we think everybody in the telecoms world has to look at them in an overall context of the ongoing business that's going on. Operators are continuing to build out in a business model that they already have, and figuring out, well, where does 5G and where do these other things fit into that? They're trying to figure out, well, how much should we expand coverage? How much should we upgrade the capability of the coverage we have? How much should we be automating, and to what extent do we need to push into new service areas? So these things are contending for the investments and attention of operators, and our ongoing research kind of deals with the trade-offs that have to be made in that. So within that larger context of things, then just keeping that in mind, we're going to start off right away, and I'm going to turn it over to Caroline Gabriel now to talk about 5G.
Thanks, Larry. Hello, everyone. I'm Caroline Gabriel, and I contribute to mobile network research across several programs at Analysys Mason, notably Next Generation Wireless and Network Investment Strategies. As Larry indicated, there was a strong message from MWC that 5G is not just a radio network. To be justified as an investment, it has to come out of its silo and be part of a broader platform that supports radical cost efficiencies as well as new revenues. So MWC may still stand for Mobile World Congress, but increasingly it reflects the issues of a fully converged network. There was almost as much discussion of fiber as there was of the radio network. And that radio discussion was framed by a bigger picture of a broad network platform that's increasingly driven by software and by technologies that have been pioneered in the web scale rather than the telecom sector. So it's very notable that there was less hype about 5G itself than in the previous 2 years of MWC, despite there being plenty of demonstrations and prototypes based on the newly standardized new radio. There was far greater emphasis, though, by vendors and operators on the wider platform which would enhance the business impact of 5G. The 5G RAN upgrade is just one of 4 cornerstones of that platform. To have greater impact than merely speeding up data rates for mobile video again, 5G will be supported by 3 other key changes, as seen to the left of the slide. Convergence with wireline and IEEE networks like Wi-Fi, massive density of cells and devices including edge compute, and virtualization and orchestration reaching from data center to RAN. In fact, the speeds and even the low latency of 5G can almost be matched with 4G enhancements. Huawei MWC showed 2 millisecond latency on a 4G air interface. More important is that 5G new radio is better adapted than 4G to support vRAN, massive density, and network slicing in a standardized way. And together, those technologies can support a far more flexible business platform. This is important because operators are looking for different economic results from their 5G investments compared to those of 4G and compared to one another. And that was very clear from many of the presentations and keynotes that the operators gave in Barcelona. For instance, Vodafone reiterated its belief that the new network must first be justified on cost savings alone. Orange, however, said it would not undergo virtualized RAN until it saw additional revenue streams as well as cost savings, but said it had not identified those yet. In other words, a business case is still being sought by many MNOs. We believe that this case will be often found in network slicing, which will create virtual optimized slices of network resources for a host of applications and eventually allow those services to become self-navigating. We've just published a major report on network slicing, the future of connectivity. In it, we envisage 3 phases towards network slicing, and this view was endorsed by many players at MWC, and you can see it represented to the right of the slide. Phase 1 entails slicing of the physical network and can start to be done today. Phase 2 allows third parties to access automatically optimized slices for a wide range of use cases. And in Phase 3, the application navigates its own way through a multi-vendor, multi-operator network, collecting the resources it requires en route and paying accordingly. This is a perfect example of how the advances of the 5G radio access network can work in tandem with end-to-end virtualization and orchestration and a software-driven network. And we'll hear more about that shortly from Caroline Chappell, who co-authored that report. Slicing will not happen overnight, but it was heartening to see many demos in Barcelona that show progress towards this radical new approach. From smaller companies like Algela, working with Turkcell and Telefonica, to the major OEMs, and ZTE won my personal prize for the best slicing demo there. That diversity from small to large vendors reflects the broader ecosystem which a full 5G platform will require and will enable. So the message was clear. 5G decisions are multifaceted, they're business case driven, and they cannot be taken in a vacuum. And they will involve a wide range of interrelated technologies, even in the network itself. To discuss those in more detail, I'm going to hand over now to Roberto Company.
Thank you very much, Caroline. So my name is Roberto Company. I'm the Senior Analyst at Analysys Mason, and I lead the Next Generation Wireless Networks program. So as we discussed, 5G networks will become far more complex, challenging vendors and operators. Many vendors and high-profile operators such as AT&T and Verizon are calling 2018 the year of 5G. We have seen a number of pre-commercial trials as well as commercial deployments announced. There has been much talk about the high data rates 5G will deliver. However, one of the key aspects of 5G networks is to drive down the cost per bit delivered by at least an order of magnitude. Innovation in radio technology will be key to achieve this. Several operators such as BT, Deutsche Telekom, AT&T have been working with the industry to reduce infrastructure costs through disaggregation of the RAN into its components and virtualization of these to create efficiencies. Industry initiatives such as Telecom Infra Project, as well as XRAN, CRAN, have been working on these solutions. Incidentally, XRAN and CRAN have now joined to become Open RAN to accelerate this work. Now, 5G also introduces a number of new technologies, such as millimeter wave spectrum, massive MIMO antennas, and beamforming, as you can see on the block diagram on your right of the slide. These will allow spectrum reuse and increase efficiency. Many new players, aside from the legacy RAN vendors, are developing sophisticated technologies in these areas. 5G will also require new spectrum bands in the sub-6 GHz and millimeter wave. So, new auctions will need to be held in most countries. Several operators have voiced, however, their concern to regulators to avoid the high prices seen before. Another point to remember, 5G will be a heterogeneous network using multiple radios and increasingly dependent on small cells to deliver greater coverage. Automation will be key for orchestrating the various network slices, and the use of AI will be important to optimize the network so large-scale device deployments, such as the use case of IoT promised by 5G, can be managed efficiently. So, part of the overall message from me is that at MWC, we saw publication, which is also in line with our publications, including the 3 critical enablers of 5G report to be published very soon, is 5G is almost here. However, operators should continue to derive benefits from their existing 4G investments and plan network trials, including technologies such as Cloud RAN and MIMO antennas on the road to deploying 5G deployments. Now, I'll hand over to Caroline Chappell.
Thank you very much, Roberto. So hello, I'm Caroline Chappell, and I'm responsible for Analysys Mason's software-controlled research program, which covers SDN and NFV. I also contribute to our network orchestration and management program, so network automation is a big area of focus for me. As we've just heard from Roberto, 5G will bring new complexity to the edge. So a major theme at MWC this year was the need to simplify the rest of the network. In particular, vendors are emphasizing the simplification of network operations so that operators can manage the network end-to-end as a seamless fabric in which connections can be turned up and torn down much more dynamically than they can today. This is, of course, a key requirement for the creation and deletion of the network slices Caroline mentioned earlier. And these de-siloed cross-network layer and domain operations will depend heavily on SDN and NFV orchestration. Simplification is a prerequisite for automation, another big theme at MWC, as Larry pointed out. You can't, or at least you shouldn't, automate complexity. And here we're seeing a potential conflict emerging between SDN and what we call cross-domain network orchestration. What was very evident at MWC is that network equipment vendors are using SDN to push policy-based, pre-programmed closed-loop automation further and further into the network, co-locating it in the controllers of network elements, with implications for existing network management systems and OSS. But this level of automation also challenges new orchestration vendors and initiatives. MWC this year confirmed that the industry is no nearer defining what the new operational stack for SDN-based networks look like, despite the progress made with ONAP, for example, which some would like to be the key frame of reference here. It's clear from the discussions I had at MWC that the market is divided, with others suggesting that ONAP may provide too heavy and centralized a level of orchestration on top of SDN, although there is interest in identifying which ONAP microservices can be reused in an SDN environment. Nevertheless, cross-domain orchestration will be needed for network slicing, as we've mentioned, another hot topic at MWC, with, as Caroline pointed out, vendors showing demos of synchronized robots and crashing trucks with toxic spills to illustrate the concept. We found widespread support for our view that while operators will need to orchestrate slices end-to-end across their physical networks, we expect these to be slices of capacity which will not necessarily be highly customized. A new cohort of what we're calling service-specific slice providers will want to orchestrate slices across multiple operators' networks to meet the needs of individual communities and/or companies. This will broaden the total addressable market for orchestration vendors, although we think that a subset of these service-specific slice providers will build their own orchestration based on a tight coupling of SDN and NFV to ensure competitive differentiation. We believe, as this slide shows, that the slicing value chain will become quite complex over time, requiring different orchestrators to talk to one another by as yet unspecified means. The ability to orchestrate virtual network functions is key for slicing and indeed to 5G, which is envisaged as a cloud-native virtualized network. Operators and vendors were keen to provide evidence at MWC that they're virtualizing networks at an accelerating pace and that they're using the cloud and orchestration to do so, rather than simply buying versions of physical network elements that run on COTS hardware with a hypervisor. In our recently published report on NFV deployment models, we point out that over 80% of publicly announced commercial implementations of NFV involve what we call virtual boxes. They're merely standalone, unorchestrated virtual network functions on COTS hardware. We still see NFV orchestration as nascent within most operators today. And with a few exceptions, there were some very interesting exceptions, such as the fact that Bharti is rolling out a VEPC on containers, supporting hundreds of thousands of subscribers. But we still think that the implementation of cloud-native VNFs in production networks has barely begun. We think cloud-native NFV is still 2 or 3 years away from mainstream implementation, although it seems to be completely accepted now as a direction of travel. The good news here is that from my conversations at MWC, I felt that there's a real emphasis on understanding the practicalities of virtualization and orchestration, a sense of rolling up of sleeves and working out how we can get this done compared to previous years where people were educating themselves on the what and the why. So AI was a big part of the network simplification and automation talk at MWC, so I'd like to hand over now to Justin, our next presenter, to talk about it.
Caroline. I'm Justin Van, the analyst at Analysys Mason for AI and Analytics, and I run the program there and have done so for a few years.
Mobile World Congress in 2018, as expected, was awash with AI. Most vendors have some angle and some take in the technology. So there's little doubt that AI is here, but it's only just begun, and we expect that there'll be a continual stream of AI-related announcements for some time to come. We were briefed by some of the more vocal operators within the AI space, both Telefonica and Orange, who have their Aura and Jingo digital virtual assistant platforms in the market space at the moment. They both see their virtual assistant platforms as really the initial step into AI, and it's built on, and I suppose this is the thing that you don't necessarily notice, actually a considerable amount of work underneath it, a whole platform in terms of the consolidation of data and the development of systems. Interestingly enough, Orange took the view that it'd be better to do a joint venture, and so they actually did a joint venture with Deutsche Telekom to develop this platform as a service. And this collaboration enabled them to build up an ecosystem of apps or providers, digital apps, which enable them to add additional functionality into their virtual assistant. And we think this is part of a sort of wider trend that we're seeing sort of a renaissance within the operator community in developing their solutions and returning to some of the technology as a key differentiator within the market space. It's something we think the vendors should be aware of and be able to sell into. So Telefonica's CEO, the Chief Data Officer, Shima Alonso, cited that the platform was going to be used for a number of other different functions as well. So the virtual assistant is really the first in these. So he looked at self-configuration, self-provisioning, self-enhancing, and self-management sort of tools associated with the same technology that have been worked out and used within the AI. And this would enable them to move to, I suppose, a notion that they want to be far more digital in terms of their automation and go through a sort of a goal for maybe a totally automated solution, or at least a very highly automated solution in the future. We heard from operators primarily that there were sort of 4 areas which were concerning them about AI at the moment, and that was really the accuracy of the insights they can get, and this is something which they have to really achieve at least an accuracy as similar to humans or better than them. the ability to scale and work really within real time. So there's a reaction, so there's no delay in terms of the interaction that's going on within processes. And of course, to allow for AI to remain accurate, there has to be a continual ability to update the algorithms associated with it. And I suppose the final point, which is worth bearing in mind as well with AI, because actually there's a cultural change which needed potentially within operators, as some of the processes will of course be looking at knowledge management personnel and decisioning based on them, and there has to be an understanding how that's going to be implemented and what the notion is in terms of rolling that in. So at the heart of all AI, there's a need for data, and indeed the more data the better. In fact, if you assume that data storage costs are falling and open source communities will continue producing very low cost AI tooling, really the insights themselves can be achieved if you have the data, and if your data is unique, you can get some unique insights. So for example, Orin's virtual assistant uses natural language processing like others. In fact, it uses nuances tools. They could have gone to Google, which would apparently cost them somewhat less, but Orange took the view that they wanted to own the IP on the French language in France. So they adopted Nuance, they owned the IP. There actually are 10 different regional dialects within France, and they trained the platform, which takes about 6 months for each one of the dialects, and now own the IP on those algorithms. And so they can actually be more accurate in understanding and conversing with different dialects within the French market. It's no real surprise that the virtual assistants is sort of one of the areas which has been targeted by operators, and that's you'll see in the chart. It's far more readily easy to implement, being that it's a greenfield project, so you're not impacting current processes or people. And it can be run in parallel to them without having to repurpose either personnel or systems within those current processes. But we are seeing, of course, that there is some augmentation which is going on with current processes, particularly in customer services, and allowing them to do a better job, maybe in terms of next best actions or these sorts of activities which are going on. One of the more recent things actually announced at the show was with Nokia, who had actually revamped their CEI, that's Customer Experience Indices, which has been used in association with customer services reps to give them a live understanding of what a customer is actually thinking in terms of the synthetic NPS or Net Promoter Score. So it can react accordingly in terms of whether they're likely to churn or not, or happy. And of course, this builds on actions based on that. So next best action solutions can use that as an indices to come up with different actions based upon it, whether to sell or to cross-sell or other activities associated with that interaction. There are various players in this space already, so people like Amdocs, Nokia, Ericsson, and others associated with that. Marketing is obviously changing significantly, and maybe one of the more interesting areas which is going on with the use of AI. There's been a heavy use of AI with particularly inbound marketing. So companies such as Flytext, who have announced a couple of major deals with Vodafone and with NTM. This is really looking at contextual-based information and being able to react in a precise way on a customer who's coming onto a site or using their application at a particular moment in time. This same sort of technology has been used for some time, really within the ad tech world, and we're seeing ad tech technology starting to come into a totally automated activity in terms of marketing. So people like Groundhog Technologies are one such vendor who actually got a mobile advertising platform associated with data, particularly built around very accurate location information with that. Others might include people like Quantcast, who have grown significantly and now looking at telcos as potential targets for marketing and as well as their external advertising activities. AI lends itself, of course, to many use cases. Security and fraud, the more obvious ones. AI can spot known patterns very quickly. It's able to create new patterns continuously. So if threats change, it's able to track those and mark those. And obviously, it can find new things which maybe haven't been spotted before, outlying information and abnormalities to the norm to flag those up as potential threats. So we've seen this sort of change and activity and actually fraud and security building up. Companies like We Do Technologies, for example, now believe that over half their new business is actually outside of their core and rather core technology based around AI. It's more fraud management and security. AI is also impacting the network operations we heard earlier on in the presentation. And maybe we heard maybe this is the start of a change of what's going on with this fully automated network operations activity. One of the case studies we heard was actually from OpenNet and Atia, who've got a North American customer who's trying to achieve 100% automation in their network operations center. And this may be the future. There's a little time to go, but it's certainly the trajectory which digital programs are trying to aim at. So we expect that technologies such as 5G, NFV, SDM might actually utilize AI technologies kind of earlier than some of the established technologies. This is partly due to the complexity of the solutions, which we alluded to earlier on in terms of the number of parameters which need to be tweaked and changed, and optimization becomes almost an impossibility with manual activity. And partly because actually these are all greenfield projects. They're looking at new technologies, and that's a good time to actually implement new processes and automations which are far less controversial based around the newer technologies. And we've seen people like Huawei, ZTE, and others who are looking at 5G rollout saying that this is going to be a key area for AI use cases. So data monetization keeps returning to Mobile World Congress, and this year is no different. Particularly, we've seen this in association with some of the IoT sensor information. And IoT, actually, is a bit of a renaissance going on. Maybe this is the year for IoT. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Michelle, who's now going to talk on that subject, and thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Justin. So my name is Michelle McKenzie, and I'm a Principal Analyst on our IoT Services Programme. So as we have written previously, while most conference presentations about 5G mention IoT as a use case, few IoT presentations mention 5G. This trend continued at Mobile World Congress. 5G was not prioritized in our IoT meetings. So IoT developers are developing solutions for today's networks and not waiting for 5G. So most of our conversations with IoT business units at Mobile World Congress revolved around the broader IoT opportunity, and specifically Narrowband IoT and LTE-M, technologies which are designed to support massive IoT. Operators are still facing a number of challenges in building their IoT businesses. There's huge expectation for IoT revenue, but for most operators it accounts for less than 1% of their total revenue. And IoT revenue growth is strong, but even if the current double-digit growth rates continue, it will take many years for IoT to be a large business for them. So expectations for IoT have probably been raised as the legacy business is seeing such weak growth for most operators. So as we show on this slide, we're forecasting that the addressable revenue from mobile and low power wide area will reach $201 billion by 2025. However, revenue from connectivity will only reach $28 billion, representing around 14% of total IoT revenue. And to put that into a wider context, this will be just 3% of worldwide mobile telecoms revenue in 2025. So as all operators know, they need to do more than connectivity if IoT is going to have a major impact on the top line. And at Mobile World Congress, the focus continued to be on how to provide a solid connectivity business on which to build a proposition that encompasses other elements such as application enablement, data analytics, and end-to-end services. And we heard from a number of operators on how they plan to do this. Telefonica, for example, is focusing on leveraging its security and data analytics competencies. And much of the focus on connectivity revolved around low-power wide area networks, especially the 3GPP Narrowband IoT and LTE-M standards.
At the GSMA's Mobile IoT event on the Sunday before Mobile World Congress, operators emphasized that narrowband IoT modules were still too expensive and not delivering long enough battery life, both of which impact scalability. And so there are still both technical and commercial barriers to address. But progress has been made. The GSMA announced that there had been 41 network launches at February 2018 by 23 operators across 26 countries. And Cisco also announced that its Jasper Control Center now supported commercial deployments of narrowband IoT, something that was piloted last year. And another issue being addressed is narrowband IoT and LTE-M roaming agreements, or rather the lack of them was also high on the agenda for many operators. Some commented that commercial roaming agreements needed renegotiating for low-power wide area networks, given the low connectivity revenue expected. Global connectivity, both for cellular and low-power wide area, is still a potential barrier for operators that want to deliver their IoT services cost-efficiently outside of their home markets. And we heard from Nokia Wing and Tele2 on their new partnership to enable Tele2 to offer global connectivity to enterprise customers. We also heard from Vodafone and China Mobile, who have formed an agreement to enable connectivity for enterprises wanting to move into China and for Chinese companies requiring connectivity outside of their home market. Operators are focusing resource on resolving the more immediate issues with building an IoT business and meeting demand for IoT with technologies that exist today. So where does 5G fit with all this? So if technologies like narrowband IoT are a huge success with hundreds of millions, if not billions of connections, it could undermine the case for 5G supporting IoT. If narrowband IoT is sufficient, why would IoT applications need 5G? And the converse may also be true. If low-power wide area technologies are not a success, then it could also raise question marks about 5G. Why would more advanced functionality be required if the basic low-power wide area technologies don't have a market? So while there are some IoT applications that could well benefit from 5G's capabilities, autonomous driving, emergency services, or possibly manufacturing, it's difficult to see these reaching hundreds of millions of connections in the short or mid-term before 2025. So while 5G may help to create new IoT services in the longer term, they're unlikely to drive the business case for 5G investment. And this is what we witnessed at Mobile World Congress this year. And with that, I'll hand back to Larry to wrap up. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. I apologize, everybody. I think we were well aware that there were problems with the audio in portions of Justin's presentation. So apologies for that. When the slides come out, there will be some explanatory additional material as well. But in the meantime, we do want to do the Q&A. I've got quite a few questions have been answered, have been entered so far, and we'll work on answering as many as we can and encourage you to go ahead and enter yours as we go along. I thought the first question that we do is, while Michelle is still sort of on tap here, is about this LPWA roaming that you brought up. What kind of applications are operators expecting to support through enabled LPWA roaming?
Okay, thanks, Larry. So LPWA roaming, it's fair to say that initially with LPWA, most of the applications that we are seeing demand for tend to be static applications, nationally bound applications, if you like, in terms of smart metering and smart cities. But that is expected to change, and there is already early signs of demand for roaming, which would support applications such as asset tracking, for example. This could be primarily in the beginning for enterprise-type applications, possibly for tracking supply chain type applications and so on, but later on possibly also for consumer applications. Also in terms of global connectivity in general, there will be demand in the future for exporters who want to export their products, consumer goods and so on, and just want to be able to monitor those goods remotely.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. A question here about the whole issue, the maturity of SDN NFV and how that relates to open source. And so, Caroline Chappell, I'm going to ask you, this question is basically along the line of is open source and OpenStack in particular losing support among telcos, and is there just enough maturity in this area for it to be taken seriously?
Well, it's interesting, Larry. I think that there are a couple of questions on this, aren't there? And I think that is SDN NFV mature enough? In particular domains, it is. It's particularly being used effectively, I think, in some very advanced enterprise B2B service providers. They are using orchestration and a great deal of automation today. They're even, experimenting or putting into the live production network, containerization, even AWS Lambdas in one case I know of. So it depends on the telco's software capability, to be frank. And some very leading edge companies can use these technologies in quite a mature way. But I would say overall the market is not particularly mature. And as I said earlier, that we're seeing the majority of deployment models are really just virtual boxes at this point. In terms of open source, I mean, again, that's interesting as well because I think the leaders are using open source where it's where they can, and it's a fairly sort of well understood piece of software as OpenStack is becoming. But I think in general, a lot of those telcos at the leading edge are really developing for themselves. They're not waiting around for standards to happen. I do agree there's a lot of fragmentation in the open source community at the moment. There are big question marks over whether and how these technologies will mature. Although interestingly at MWC, there are companies bubbling up. There's a company called Innoside, for example, that is actually sort of standing behind open source technologies and will implement this for you and certify it and get it to work and so on. So I think there's some interesting opportunities there to make open source more accessible. However, I think yes, there are certainly, we're a very long way off deploying fully automated and orchestrated 5G networks. Enrique Blanco, CTIO of Telefonica, was saying that that's going to be the key differentiator of whether you're running a 5G network or not. Not antennas. He said we know how to do antennas, but it's the difficult bit is the virtualization, is the automation and orchestration.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. So thank you. A lot of good questions coming in here. I think at the risk of some of our audio problems, there was a question about where do you see AI and 5G, which is a nice big question to think about. And I'll just mention that a very specific area that we know about in that regard is in self-organizing networks. We've just developed a report, which I don't think has yet been published, but Caroline Gabriel, if you would respond on that particular issue, and then perhaps Justin, hopefully the audio works, you can respond in some other ways on AI and 5G.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. Yes, as Justin referred to, there are lots of different uses for AI within the telco business, but the one that I get particularly interested in is using AI and machine learning for planning and optimizing and organizing the network itself. And Roberto and I, as you said, are just about to publish a report which regards self-organizing network and increasingly the use of AI in that as a key enabler of 5G. The reason for that being that we expect 5G to have so many more moving parts than previous networks. So more cells, because it will be in many areas a very dense network, but also massively more devices, edge compute nodes, and other bits and pieces that will need to be continually optimized and organized. So at this point, that has to be automated. It can't be manually optimized. But of course, if you bring machine learning into play, it can also become predictive. It can start to spot problems, overloads, issues in the network before they happen, and go to fix them, or proactively move a person or a device to a different cell or a different connection. Which of course then has a knock-on effect on both on user experience and satisfaction, but also the efficiency of how resources are being used, because the network doesn't just self-heal, but it starts to learn where it will need more resource in future and where it won't. So that can be quite a good OPEX saving rather than investing in capacity everywhere in the network. You get a much more granular view of when and where you're going to need additional resource. So I think in the next 3 to 5 years, that's going to become a very important aspect of AI for telcos, and one with a fairly obvious return on investment that they're already calculating now.
Okay. Justin, other comments on this sort of open-ended question about AI and 5G?
No, I think Caroline pretty much hit it. I mean, I would say that the difference between maybe this sort of use case, if you like, and compared with others, is that, as Caroline said, there's a realization that without AI, you can't really do that optimization. You can't really do the network planning side of it. And certainly, if you're looking at any sort of dynamic changes based on services, the problem is just too complex without some kind of automation, and that has to be derived from some complex algorithms derived from AI technology. So, and you know, as I said, the nice thing about it, we may see this coming in, you know, some of the techniques being applied here a little earlier than maybe in some of the current technology which is out there, partly because it will be a greenfield site. And so some of those techniques and technologies, I think, will be maybe rolled out even prior to some of the, against some of this newer technology opposed to some of the older ones, just by dint of the normal practice. It's more difficult to change what's currently in play than playing around with a sort of greenfield site process. So yes, it's going to be a sort of must-have opposed to a sort of an improvement or optimization of a process which goes on in terms of 5G.
Okay. Thank you, Justin. A question back to Michelle about IoT, and actually I'm going to line up two questions here. So the first of these that I see is, I think maybe a simple question for you, Michelle. Are there any LTE-M devices that are available ready for the market today?
Yes, there are. So AT&T and Verizon in the US are already rolling out commercial services. So there are devices available. I think generally, not just for LTE-M, but for Narrowband IoT as well, as I mentioned in my presentation, there are still some issues around devices in terms of cost is one of them. And again, we're back to that chicken and egg situation, really, where you know, once we start to see volumes in the marketplace as demand grows, we expect some of those device costs to come down.
Okay. And then another question, sort of in a different vein, has to do with just the amount of data generated by every device being connected, and to what extent this was a topic last week at Mobile World Congress, that some of these devices produce a lot of data, although perhaps many of them don't produce that much on their own right. But just any particular issues under discussion, Michelle, about the amount of data that has to be handled?
Yeah, well, there are several issues there. First of all, suffice to say that there's probably not the vast volumes of data being produced yet today for some of these applications. It varies a lot, obviously. and that is expected to grow. But what we did see last week was that there's a lot of attention being focused on how that data is captured, the quality of the data, all of the security around the data and who the guardians of that data should be. And then moving, of course, into the data analytics and helping enterprises to use that data in a meaningful way. So there's lots of work going on in that area, and lots of operators and obviously vendors as well, looking at how to resolve some of those problems.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. There have been a number of questions asking how do people get the slides and so forth, so I'll repeat that you will be getting an email with information on downloading the slides and access to a replay on this. So everybody should be able to get access to the slides within a day or so. Good 5G question for us here that I'm going to direct to you, Roberto, is very simple. What's the status of millimeter wave?
Yeah, thanks, Larry. So actually, we've seen quite a lot around millimeter wave, and particularly this year, there were a lot of demonstrations by the different companies, Qualcomm, Intel, showing their kit. So millimeter wave is the way that the industry will deliver the high gigabit data rates. It will be using a lot of high spectrum bandwidth, but obviously these have a lot of technical challenges still to be overcome, and the design themselves are not easy. However, as I say, there's a lot of prototypes out there, and there's a lot of antenna companies working, not just the legacy RAN vendors, but a lot of new vendors coming onto the market, developing massive MIMO antennas, and these will be essential to deliver data over millimeter wave.
Okay, thank you. Another IoT question for you, Michelle. Did blockchain feature into the context of IoT?
In the conversations that we had, specifically with operators, blockchain didn't come up a great deal. And perhaps that's in contrast to previous years where there's been a great deal of activity and talk around blockchain. But this year, I would say that in the conversations we had, at least, it was fairly muted.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Back to sort of the artificial intelligence area, sort of just a question about the balanced distribution of IPR and knowledge in the between carriers and suppliers on AI in the AI value chain. So I think you made some allusion to this, Justin, but there's a question for a little bit more discussion about that balance between the vendors and the operators on the.
Yeah. Okay. So I think this worth bearing in mind. Firstly, that there are some major players out here who are actually involved with the with AI. So it's the Googles, the IBMs, AWS, and so on and so forth, who actually have a huge amount of data at their disposal. And things like NLP, natural language processing, which we see going on there, they've got massive data sets on which to train their models. And so it is a bit one-sided in a sense. Certainly, if you're in the English spoken language in that particular instance, it's very skewed towards those sort of characters. More data is a good thing. The more data you have, the more accurate your models can become. Now, of course, if you look at some processes that you're trying to apply some of these things to, there may just not be enough scale within an operator, a single operator, to be accurate enough. And what I was alluding to, I suppose, within my talk is that accuracy is absolutely vital in terms of the adoption of AI. If it's inaccurate or not as accurate as human beings, it gets sort of rejected quite quickly. And so, being able to train those models is pretty important. I think from a vendor's perspective, there are therefore advantages in some of the specialist areas. So avoiding some of the mainstream things like natural language processing or tonal or sentiment analysis, which you've got some very large players in, but the ones which are specific to telecoms, And if you're looking at things which are only found in the telecoms market and therefore have a speciality associated with them, the scale which a vendor can provide over and above that of a single operator could again be an advantage for those vendors. The differences, of course, happen if you start messing around with particular processes and make them very proprietary or unique to a CSP. You're going to lose some of that advantage, as it would be in with any adoption of any sort of application-based technologies. So I suppose it's a bit. Yeah, you've got every process is going to be different, and the data associated with it's going to be a little bit different in terms of your thing. But there certainly are some plays for both operators if they think they've got some unique data sets, and there are some plays obviously for vendors who believe they understand particular processes particularly well.
Okay, thanks, Justin. So we have several questions sort of having to do with so what's the time frame for the rollout of 5G? And like I said, there's several questions, so there's several different angles on this. And I appreciate that this is a sort of a question many people have, and many people have opinions about it. So I'm going to attempt to give you some context on what we see going on there that's from both the research we've been doing for some time related to this, as well as what we learned last week. And then Caroline Gabriel, I'm going to ask you maybe to chime in addition to what I may say there. But I think that we kind of see sort of two camps in the 5G. How fast is 5G going to roll out? There is one camp, which is it's a new radio. Everybody's going to want it. As soon as we can start rolling out the technology, people will trial it, and as soon as it gets trialed, people are going to want to. And that rollout is going to start happening this year, and will and progress at a fairly rapid pace. There's sort of a camp around that. There were some specific questions about what people thought was going to happen in the EU. And what I would say is we don't hear that particularly in Europe. We hear it maybe more likely in North America and somewhat in Asia, and not much enthusiasm for that line of thinking in Europe. And it has to do with points a number of people raising questions about, I just rolled out LTE. I'm still finishing the rollout of LTE. We haven't gotten the benefit of that investment. What's the real appetite for, and what the real need for 5G in that context? And I think that's just a really good question, and many operators are asking exactly that question. Is there enough payoff from 5G as it stands right now to make it a sensible investment, or shouldn't I hold off and in fact do the preparation? So I think that Caroline made reference to a research report we've done that says, how do you get ready for 5G? And that's based on research we've done and looking at what many operators are trying to do in thinking about that, getting ready for 5G. So Caroline Gabriel, perhaps you have a little bit more specifics about commenting on that.
Yeah, sure, Larry. I mean, you're completely right what you've just said, and we have indeed been conducting surveys of operators for a couple of years now about their 5G timelines and plans. Quite large-scale surveys, up to 100 operators. And what we're learning from that is that, yes, we shouldn't get too distracted by a few trailblazers that we all know very well. In the USA, although they're starting off with fixed wireless, and in Japan, China, South Korea. But as Larry said, far more cautiousness in Europe, and indeed in quite a few of the other regions of the world. A lot of operators, I mean, in our estimate, at least 2/3 will not be deploying 5G at scale until after 2022, and some much later. So a lot of operators will do a city or will do a showcase here and there, but in terms of really having it available to quite a large proportion of the population, that's going to be a 5-year plan, and more in some areas. What's really important to remember is how quickly and richly LTE continues to evolve. So 4G is going to be with us for a long time. NTT Docomo, who's very 5G focused, but they've said multiple times that they expect to continue to actively enhance their 4G network for a decade, even though they're also bringing in 5G. So this is a real, the plans are all about coexistence and balancing resources between the two radio networks to get the best efficiencies and to deliver the use cases. And as I mentioned in my slides, LTE is doing a lot of what 5G was originally thought to be only able to do. That Huawei demo of 2 millisecond latency on an LTE air interface sort of blew me away. We didn't believe that would be possible with 4G. So the operators will deploy 5G when they can see a business case, and we're hearing particularly a lot from the European operators, as Larry said, that they are still looking for a business case. Just today, EE here in the UK said they're still looking for a business case for 5G, and that's, that they're echoing what a lot of their competitors say. And coming back to what several of us talked about this afternoon, we don't believe they'll get those returns and those business cases without the broader platform that will enable them to take advantage of the unique capabilities of 5G. So the platform needs to come first, or at least needs to be planned in parallel with the 5G radio.
Right. And Caroline, you made reference to fixed wireless access, and I think it's worth noting that there is, particularly in the North American market, maybe a unique opportunity there, and maybe in some other markets in something of a niche mode, the value of fixed wireless access for mobile operators that have a national mobile footprint but don't have a national fixed footprint. That there's the business case for that actually can be fairly straightforward. We know that a converged service offer is more powerful, that the people can build the business case for having fixed and mobile offered to the same customer base versus mobile only. So there certainly are that particular case that we think it may make a lot of sense, particularly in North America. But it's a bit of a niche case when we think of 5G on a more global sense. So I think we haven't necessarily answered every question here, but I think we've tried to cover most of them. There are a couple of very specific questions that people asked, clarification things and all. I think we'll just get back with you specifically and make sure that we send you an answer. So if you said, well, I asked a question on something specific here, a number of those things we'll respond in that regard. As I mentioned, we will be sending out an email to everybody who registered with information on link to the recording, as well as the ability to download the slides. So with that, I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you all for your participation and look forward to continue working with you in the future. Thanks for now.